So you've got a book, 12 Truths and a Lie. I love that title, the subtitle, Answers to Life's Biggest Questions. And we're living in such a confused and chaotic culture right now. There are a lot of questions, but I've got to ask you just to start, the rise of the my truth and your truth. And I'll say generation, but I think it's actually something that's affecting every generation right now, particularly younger people. What do you make of this my truth, your truth mantra?
Yeah. I think part of it comes from just a lack of courage to be able to say, when something is right or wrong. We all understand that there are subjective kinds of truth. I mean, to say, I feel hot, my wife will always say, I feel cold. That's my truth in that moment is I feel hot. But you don't apply that to things like, if my truth ends up becoming something like, my truth is your driveway belongs to me. My neighbor's going to say, well, your truth actually violates my property line. And so when it comes to things about God, for some reason, we think that for morals, that it's more like something that fits. And we believe that, Billy, until it doesn't work. When somebody begins to put their morals on us in a way that's offensive to us, or we encounter people in a different culture that think that, for example, women should be subservient, not be educated and step outside the home. We say, well, that's wrong. It's just a convenient thing that we use, I think, to mask a lack of courage that ultimately causes our society to implode. Because while it may work for us when it comes to things like, gender and sexuality, at least we think it does, we know that it doesn't work ultimately when it comes to establishing truth and beauty and meaning.
Yeah, you look at relativism, everybody walking around acting as though all these things can be true at the same time. It really is interesting how quickly biblical Christianity, the truth, becomes offensive to people, right? Suddenly there's a line for some people that they've found. And the truth is there's a line for everybody, right? It just depends on where that is. Nobody truly embraces everything. You just have to make a decision on where that line is, right?
That's right. Yeah, one of the things I actually talk about in the book, 12 Truths and a Lie, is talk about how the Bible, sometimes 21st century Americans are arrogant enough to think that we're the first generation ever in history to be offended by the Bible. And, you're like, look, the Bible's been offending people in every generation for different reasons. I served I lived overseas for a while in a Muslim country, and I know for our hearers right now, those that are watching, this is almost like, it seems crazy, but this Muslims that I was with in this country, they were very offended by Jesus's forgiving of the woman caught in adultery, because they thought, if he just forgives her, then what's that going to do to society? They were offended by that. Well, we Americans tend to be offended on the other side. How dare we make, how dare there be things that prescribe the right ways that lead to sexual things that lead to flourishing. I always say the Bible's an equal opportunity offender. If you're not being offended by it, you're just not listening. And one of you would expect that to be true if this is God speaking to us. I kind of start with the presupposition that, a lot of what I believe may be wrong. Because if it came out of my head, when I look at the world that I'm in and how humans have messed that up, maybe I need something from outside of myself. God speaking to me and giving me truth that I haven't come up with on my own yet.
Yeah, it's so, life is so complicated, right? I also do find it interesting, a lot of people on the more secular side, when they quote Jesus, they'll tend to talk about, his love, which is obviously true, and his compassion and his care, but the go and sin no more part of the conversation seems to often be absent. And so you can fall very heavily on one side or the other without that balance of truth and love. But one of the things, I wanted to ask you about, related but sort of separately, is, questions and doubts, because I do think there are a lot of people, even in the church, who have questions, they have doubts, and they often don't voice them, or they don't know the answers to specific questions. Why do you think it is important, and you deal with questions in the book, for Christians to openly deal with those doubts?
Yeah, no, great question. In fact, the title of the book, 12 Truths and a Lie, the 12 truths are answers to the most common questions that I get asked, whether that's from college students or people in the congregation that I serve. The one lie I included in the book was that the presence of those questions or doubts makes you a bad Christian. It means there's something defective with your faith. I found that when I began to, as a pastor, verbalize just questions I struggle with, and honestly, man, I have a PhD in theology, and I've been a pastor for 20 years, and I still got questions about certain things. I found that when I verbalized them, a lot of people in our congregation sort of came out of the woodwork and said, I've asked the same thing, and I've wondered the same thing and been afraid to ask. I tell them, and this is one of the things I try to bring out in the book, is that a lot of our Bible, a lot of it was written by people who were in the midst of some really difficult questions. It's like they were saying, God, why not this? And why aren't you doing this? And if you were really in charge, I feel like this would be different. Charles Spurgeon, one of the great pastors of the 19th century in Great Britain, he said that doubt is like a foot poised. You pick your foot up. He says it can go forwards or backwards. It's true. Doubt can drive you backwards into unbelief. But it's also true you'll never really take steps forward until you've picked up your foot. And so doubt can be it's a divine invitation to press deeper into, intimacy with God, to really get to truth, to kind of let the superficialities of your faith, the Sunday school faith that you inherited as pat answers. Doubt can be a divine invitation for you to press deeper in, to actually learn significant things about who God is and why you can trust him, even in the midst of unanswered questions.
Yeah, I mean, you often wonder, a lot of people, I would assume, and maybe you see this as a pastor, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are people who have doubts that go unanswered, and for years they quietly sort of sit on them, and eventually, if those things aren't answered, they could lead you down the wrong path, lead you away from faith, lead you into more confusion, I would
Right.
imagine. Is that accurate? Have you seen that a lot in
I mean,
ministry?
absolutely. So if you are waiting on all questions that you have about, it could be about morality, it could be about, where we all came from and what's going to happen in the future, or anything. If you're waiting on answers to all of your doubts to be resolved, then you'll never be a person who will have any peace with Christ. In fact, the Bible writers did not learn all the answers to their questions. A lot of times what they got was Jesus saying, "You know me, and you can trust me. And even where you don't necessarily understand the answer, you can trust that there is an answer because I rose from the dead." When it comes to certain questions of, why didn't God step in and intervene here, whether I'm thinking about some historical event or just things in my life, there are points where I've had to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I trust that if Jesus died on a cross for me, if he really was the Son of God, died on a cross for me, and if he rose from the dead, then I can trust that there's an answer to this, even if I can't quite grasp it yet. Sometimes what we want is explanation, and what God gives us instead is revelation. Gives us Jesus rather than all the answers to all the finer points of the questions we may have.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I often will ask people their biggest concern about the culture in general, but lately, especially when I'm talking to people like you, I've shifted that question, and it can be a little tricky, but I'm going to ask it of you. What do you think the biggest challenge is, or the biggest thing that concerns you rather, is about the church today, specifically Christians?
Yeah, I mean, what you see is you see a gradual kind of separating into little partisan tribes. Christians feel safer when they're around other Christians and sort of a huddle in a church, and there we don't have to worry about the attacks of the culture around us, and that's devastating for the church because the church is supposed to be salt and light in their community. It's also devastating for the community, the community itself. On Thursday, I'm doing this big thing at one of our local universities here because of the mental health crisis that is taking place on our college campuses. And it's sort of, I mean, I'm not trying to mock it because it's tragic, but it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're seeing, these colleges tear out any kind of sense of transcendent meaning from the lives of these students and saying we're nothing times nobody equals everything, and we're all just a cosmological biological accident, and then now try to find meaning out of that. Well, of course these students can't find meaning. Secularism doesn't have an answer to the deepest needs of the human soul. And what that shows us is that the tragedy of this kind of separated existence where God doesn't belong in the public square and he doesn't belong in the university and he doesn't belong there. It's left a world that is imploding from the inside because there's no more core anymore of what we believe and what life is about and what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, and not to launch into 12 other related topics, but you look at the public schools, you look at, these are complicated issues, obviously, and people can debate them all day long about the First Amendment and all that. But the reality is you take prayer out of schools, you take God out of schools, you take morality out of schools, something else is going to replace it. There's some other viewpoint perspective that's going to be there. And I think that's what we're watching happen, not
Yeah.
just in colleges, throughout all of these institutions. And you draw almost a graph, and it's a tragic graph to where people are today, what we believe, what we think, how we behave, and what we believe about ourselves and our separation from God culturally. And it's very clear what's happening. And so, I guess I'll ask you this. Why do you think, and maybe it's spiritual blindness, I don't know, but why do you think we continue to descend knowing what really is going on and that we've sort of caused this in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like the pastor here, but one of the things about walking away from God, whether you call that sin or rebellion or finding your own way, is it always promises more than it delivers. And it just seems like, independence. If I could just be free to write my own rules, if I could, I always tell my kids that sin, you can understand sin just by the middle letter, SIN. It's when I want to write my own rules and I want to be the point. And that looks so appealing until you start to be separated from the source of life itself. We talk about Nicholas Copernicus, who discovered that the Earth was not in the center of the solar system. We kind of arrogantly thought we were the center and everything revolved around us. Well, it turns out that's actually a good thing that we're not, because the sun is 30,000 times bigger than the Earth, and the Earth would never have the ability to keep everything in orbit. So it's good that we're just one little planet circling around that. Well, if you think about that in a spiritual sense, we want to be the center of our own universe and write our own rules, and we think that would just be amazing. The problem is we weren't created to play the role of God. And we don't have the gravitational gravitas to be able to hold everything in orbit. The best thing possible for us is to have the sun, which in this analogy would be God, at the center. That's when our lives work the best. And that's when we find kind of what we're created for.
Yeah, no, that is so true. And I could ask you 1,000 questions about this because I love picking your brain on it. But you have a book that people could pick up and read and deal with some of this 12 Truths and a Lie, Answers to Life's Biggest Questions. And we've been talking about that. Who is this book for, and what are you hoping they take away from it?
Yeah, so the genesis of the book, Billy, is that I used to, on college campuses, in fact, I still do this, campus groups would sometimes bring me in and just basically to set up a mic and open an invitation, and we'd have several hundred students come in and just ask questions. And when people found out I did that, they were always like, man, how in the world do you do that? These students are so smart. And I was like, and I don't mean this with any disrespect, but I'm like, they only ever ask different versions of the same 5 questions. And so once you kind of get your answer on those questions, you find that you at least are able to give the beginnings of an answer. And so that kind of turned into a podcast that I do called Ask the Pastor, where I just take questions, whether from the college students or the community, and I just answer them in kind of short ways. And then we took the 12 most popular questions I get, and we turned that into a book. They're going to range everywhere from if God is good and loving, why did bad things happen to seemingly good people, to how can I know for sure I'm going to go to heaven, to like if Christianity is true, why is the Christian life so hard? Why does God care so much about my sex life, and a bunch of others like that.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. And these are the questions people have. I think suffering, especially now, people are looking at what's going on and all these lies that have happened in culture. Right now, you're watching young people, I think, really kind of wake up some of them and say, well, all the things you promised me I would have, they're not coming to fruition. They're not happening. And so maybe there's something more. And, before we go, I just wanted to ask you about Asbury and all of the other, quote unquote revivals. Some people are debating whether or not they think it's that, but clearly spiritual manifestations, baptisms, I mean, these things that we're watching happen right now. Do you think it is a result of maybe people realizing some of these cultural lies are just that, lies?
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good read on it. Maybe if I could just back it up one step farther from that. John Lennon, the Beatles, famously said sometime in the 1960s, before I was alive, and I'm assuming you also, John Lennon said, that the day would soon come when religion would just be irrelevant. It's just like nobody would really talk about it. That science and technology would remove the need for God. Well, I mean, here we are several years later. While institutional religion may not be as well known or popular. People's quest for spirituality still is. People are more religious today than they were when John Lennon was alive. And that's because there's a religious, spiritual impulse in us that just can't be taken away. And so there's a lot of stuff about deconstruction. There's a lot of things, but there's a quest that we can't get over. And that is, there's a missing piece from my life. To quote Blaise Pascal, there's a God-shaped hole. And nothing I try will fit into that hole, whether it's success or relative truth. It just won't quite work. And that's because you and I were created for the love of God that we find in Christ. And so, yes, I think with all of this secularism, you're seeing a new generation that is hungry for genuine experiences with, not with dead religion, but with a living God who manifests himself in Jesus Christ and in the Holy Spirit.
Well, that is a powerful place for us to close. The book is 12 Truths and a Lie. J.D. Greear, appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me on it.